The challenge of balancing the grid has dramatically increased as intermittent sources like solar and wind play a larger and larger role. And if we don't get it right, the impact can be catastrophic. Too much energy on the grid and things start blowing up. Too little and you get blackouts. Imagine you're working at the operations center of a utility. One afternoon, clouds pass over a big solar farm and your available electricity suddenly drops by 5%. Or a storm suddenly increases the production from a wind farm. You want as many tools in your repertoire as possible to keep the supply and demand perfectly balanced. And there's a tool, demand response, that we're not using nearly as much as we could. But first, I'll briefly explain what utilities have used in the past, then what is becoming more and more the tool of choice. Then we'll get to the third tool that we should be using more. A utility has control over the power plants and can, to some degree, turn them up and down. This is primarily what's been used to balance the grid until recently. But most power plants have an optimum amount of power they generate, so running them hot or cold reduces their efficiency. What sometimes happens when there's too much power on the grid is dispatch down, which I talk about in this video. When this happens, a wind operator is told to feather their blades and stop producing power. This is power that we could have for free if the grid could handle it. When there's not enough power, the grid operator will fire up inefficient and expensive single-cycle gas generators. These can easily be turned up and down since they're always inefficient. So fiddling with the supply has a host of problems. The second option is to store the energy when it's abundant and use it when it's needed. But up until recently, storage was difficult to build. It primarily consisted of pumped hydro, building two reservoirs, one high and one low. When power is needed, water flows downhill through a generator. When there's excess power, that same water is pumped up the hill. In Ireland, we have one facility like this, Turlough Hills, which took 6 years to build, coming online in 1974. Up until this year, this was the only significant storage on the Irish grid. With the advent of grid-scale batteries, this is changing. In many places, these have already supplanted gas peaker plants and will definitely be the primary tool for grid balancing going forward. So let's talk about the third option, demand response. Here, when there's excess power on the grid, the demand is increased, and when there's not enough, the demand is decreased. I'm going to talk about residential opportunities, but currently demand response is primarily available for industrial and commercial customers. According to the Demand Response Association of Ireland, there's 700 megawatts of demand response at commercial and industrial sites across the island, which represents over 10% of peak demand. It's easier for the utility to manage a few big sites than millions of small ones. The ideal demand response opportunity has no impact on the end user, but these demand response opportunities are disruptive to the companies, so they're only activated about 20 times a year when the grid is really stressed. And they aren't used to increase demand when there's excess energy. Let's look at some common household uses of electricity and ask whether the resident cares when it's on. If you're making your dinner, you want your stove or oven to be working while you're cooking, not late at night. Your TV and computer need to work on your schedule, not the utilities. Lights need to be on when you want to see at night. An extreme example is a home medical device like a CPAP machine. When it's on, it needs to work. These uses are not appropriate for demand response. But let's think of some that are. You don't care so much about when your freezer kicks in as long as your food doesn't thaw. You don't care much about when your water heater heats the water as long as you can take a hot shower when you want. If your house gets a degree or two warmer or colder than ideal, you probably wouldn't notice. You don't care when your EV charger is on as long as your car is charged when you leave. These examples all have an element of storage in cold food, hot water, warm walls and furniture, and a charged battery. These are good candidates for demand response. To be clear, this is not about energy efficiency or conservation. This is not insulating your attic or switching to a heat pump. That can and should be done as well, but demand response is not about reducing your energy use, but just shifting the demand to times when it's cheaper and cleaner to meet this demand without creating an impact on the user. But while there are just a handful of large power plants, a utility might have millions of residential customers, and each customer might have dozens of devices that are using electricity. It's much harder to tweak tens of millions of knobs, and it's unrealistic to expect customers to pay attention to the needs of the utility and switch on and off their water heater. Any working system must be effortless for the consumer. There isn't yet a consensus on the best way to manage residential demand response, but any solution will require appliances that can talk to the internet. And the customer must be compensated by the utility for participating. Since heating and cooling the home is the largest residential energy use, that's often the focus of residential demand response programs, leveraging smart thermostats like Google's Nest. These thermostats can be controlled by the resident with an app, but if you participate in a program, can also be controlled by the utility. Imagine a winter storm that has knocked down some lines and everyone's heat is on. The situation on the grid is so strained that there's a risk of a blackout. But instead, settings on thousands of thermostats reduce the temperature by 2 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius. A blackout is prevented and no one freezes to death. Or charging EVs. Smart chargers can communicate with the utility and only charge the car when power is plentiful, when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. Let's take a typical day of a Californian family's hot water heater. Here you see the average cost of electricity to the utility on the day-ahead market, with a small morning peak, a drop in cost of electricity at midday driven by solar power, and then a large evening peak as the sun is setting. The utility sends a message to the water heater to turn on between 1 and 4 a.m. By the time of the morning peak at 5 a.m., the heater is off and the tank is full of hot water. At 8 a.m., the solar panels are kicking in across the state and costs come down. By 10 a.m., there's an excess of electricity on the grid, so now's the time for the water heater to kick on. By 2 p.m., the tank is full of hot water again, and there's plenty of water for Billy's shower in the evening and doing dishes and laundry. That's how demand response can work in areas with significant solar power. Shift demand to midday when production is high, or at night when demand is low. If the cost curve is stable, the utility might just go with time of use metering, which can accomplish the same thing but is much easier to implement. Heat water and charge cars at midday and at night, not at dawn or dusk. No need for communication between the device and the utility, just a timer. It requires a smart meter that can tell when the power is consumed, not just how much. For instance, I've set our EV charger to only work between 1 and 5 a.m. That's long enough to fully charge the car at a time when demand is low. But time of use metering doesn't allow the utility to respond to unusual weather or unexpected equipment failures. As the time of peak wind power production is less consistent than solar, demand response is a much more powerful tool than time of use metering for wind-dominated grids like Ireland's. When the wind is blowing, the utility can send a message to turn on the hot water heaters and the electric car chargers regardless of the time of day. Demand response doesn't mean the utility doesn't need batteries, it just means they don't need as many. Batteries and demand response are making gas peaker plants uneconomical and unnecessary, which will reduce the cost of energy for everyone. But setting up a residential demand response program is difficult and requires educating consumers why participating helps make everyone's electricity cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable. Most importantly, it requires the consumer to give up some control and trust the utility will not leave them with cold water when they want to take a shower or a car with no range when they want to drive. Overcoming this resistance is probably the hardest job in setting up a demand response program. But maybe now you understand why a well-designed demand response program might be right for you. You can support this channel by buying me a pint or a YouTube thanks, or watch more of my videos. If you've learned something, please like and subscribe, and leave a comment on what you've done to move your electricity demand away from the evening peak. And share this video with everyone you know who would like to lower their electricity bills.